Hi, I'm Jay Allen Sanford from the San Diego Reader and Rock and Roll Comics. I'm here to walk you through another episode of the 1950s television anthology Tales of Tomorrow. My qualifications for joining my esteemed colleagues here on these DVD commentaries include articles I've written for magazines like Starlog, FilmFax, Midnight Marquee, and the San Diego Reader, which published the in-depth history of this program a while back that actually led to this DVD set that you're watching and hopefully enjoying. The article actually started back in 1989. It was commissioned by Midnight Marquee magazine, and I actually interviewed most of the creators that were still living at the time and several performers that were involved in making the series. They were mostly taped phone conversations. Unfortunately, those interviews subsequently got filed away in a box and basically were lost for over 30 years. A couple years ago, I actually found them. Unfortunately, all of my interviewees had since passed away, but I transcribed the tapes, digitized them, and I wrote what I hope is the definitive Tales of Tomorrow history for the reader. And that again resulted in this DVD set being created. You see here we're watching a commercial from the more frequent sponsor on the program, Chrysler. They were one of the original sponsors. We talked about them at length in the Window episode commentary and what a role sponsors really played in television in the 50s, dictating content, literally. In the case of Tales of Tomorrow, that episode, The Window, actually has a sponsor appearing on camera and addressing the audience directly about their product in the midst of the actual action of the program happening, because the sponsor was determined that even though the story called for there to be a continuous non-cutaway, they said, we're going to get our ad in there somehow or other. And Rod Serling, of course, when he started The Twilight Zone a few years after this, one of the reasons he did so was because the television dramas that he was writing for programs like Studio One would not allow him to talk about the sort of issues that he wanted to deal with on television. Issues about racism and sexism and things that on The Twilight Zone, of course, he could couch in the sort of patina of science fiction and sort of get away with it. Tales of Tomorrow presaged that quite a bit. We talked earlier about how it's called often television's first science fiction anthology, but that's really only marginally correct. There were, of course, other science fiction anthologies that dealt in science fiction before this on television. And Tales of Tomorrow itself straddled many genres. Often, in the space of a single episode, you'd have a horror and sometimes even something like a Cold War spy drama. This one that we're watching is called The Evil Within, and it melds science fiction, and believe it or not, there's an element of slasher movies in here, in that there's a very big knife at the end of it. This episode actually was first broadcast on May 1st, 1953, and we're watching Rod Steiger here. He somewhat unconvincingly plays a scientist. He's brought home his work, which is the first indication that he's not really much of a scientist. His wife's very enthusiastic because she clearly doesn't see a whole lot of this guy. He's absolutely married to his work, doesn't seem to pay much attention to her, and doesn't really seem to notice the fact that all she wants is a little nod of his attention. She really kind of upstages Rod Steiger in this. We'll talk about her a bit more in a moment. But I want to talk about the director of this, Don Medford. He actually did quite a few Tales of Tomorrow. He did 34 episodes altogether as far as directorial work. He also did a little bit of scripting for them, sometimes uncredited. And he was at this time just kicking off a career that would find him scripting somewhere in the range of 100 different TV shows. You'd probably best know him from 5 episodes of The Twilight Zone. He also did Alfred Hitchcock Presents. He did the final episode of The Fugitive, which in 1967 was one of the most watched TV broadcasts in history. Something like 78 million people saw that. He did something like 36 episodes of The FBI, the Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. series. He did a couple dozen Berettas with Robert Blake. He did a bunch of Dynasty. He actually occasionally scripted and produced shows like those as well. If you're to really look for the work of his that best exemplifies what you're going to see of his here on Tales of Tomorrow, I would cite those Twilight Zones. The 5 that he did were A Passage for Trumpet with Jack Klugman. He did the Genie episode, The Man in the Bottle. He did The Mirror with Peter Falk, which is not one of the more highly regarded ones. Death's Head Revisited with the concentration camp, another probably a lesser light for Rod Serling's program. And he did one of the hour-long episodes, which are also not all that well thought of, but it's one of the better ones, actually. He did one called Death Ship from the 1963 season, when Serling experimented with the hour-long format. Medford, like most directors in the anthology format, worked better in this sort of half-hour slot, which in this case, of course, is around 22 minutes with commercials. I actually interviewed Man Rubin, one of the producers of this series, and when I did, he singled out Don Medford as a very welcoming director. And I'll go ahead and read you a quote of his. He said, quote, "He was very good, he was always very visual, and he would plan out the concepts to move the camera. I always felt very secure with him, and he knew exactly what to do with the scripts. There were other directors that didn't really want you around." And others that I spoke with said the same thing. He actually would invite writers onto the set, and there was one writer where he let him bring his girlfriend one time to impress her. Actually, Don Medford lived at the age of 95. He passed away in 2013. So in this episode, we're watching Rod Steiger as a scientist. He's invented this serum that's kind of a Jekyll and Hyde thing. It's described as bringing out the primal beast in anyone that comes in, that it gets injected into. As it turns out, anything it comes into contact with. The script, I think the quote is, it causes a sudden and overpowering, unnatural urge to destroy everything you love. And they tested on some monkeys. And as one would expect, things are not going to go well. It's really funny that Tales of Tomorrow, although it champions science, it frequently would portray scientists as complete dumbasses. I mean, absolutely dimwits that are blundering and downright dangerous, and given, left on their own like this guy, they might just destroy the world. So it's really a running theme throughout the show. We talk about it in several other commentaries that basically anytime you meet a scientist, you know that you're looking at the root of this episode's problem. This actually goes all the way back to the second episode of the series, which is called Blunder. It's based on a story by the author of When Worlds Collide, Philip Wiley. It's just one of the many mad scientists over the course of the show. Robert Allen plays a scientist he's willing to risk destroying the entire world, destroying its oxygen supply, and initiating doomsday just to complete his experiment. And even after everyone tells him that this is the most likely result, he's determined to do this. And of course, all his fellow scientists call him out publicly as a big blundering dick. And the scientist in Substance X, also big blundering dick, develops a new type of vitamin food substitute that it takes away everyone's essential needs. So it ends up being, they don't have any desire to eat. They don't want to work. They just want this, what they call Substance X. Kind of a metaphor for dope, obviously. An entire town gets hooked on the thing, and of course, the fact that the local grocery store can't sell anything and no one's eating anything, that's really just the beginning of their problems. And that was a case where also an allegorical approach to a societal problem was handled. But scientists also, in Read to Me, Herr Doctor, that features a scientist who creates a robot who then enslaves him and his daughter. And because it has this insatiable hunger for data, and it also is hot for his daughter. Boris Karloff appears in one. He's in a time travel episode called Past Tense. He plays a scientist he has a life-saving medicine he wants to bring to the world of 1910, but not to save lives. His plan is to sell it at a profit, which of course earns him pretty much the reward that he deserves. There's an episode called Ahead of His Time, and the fellow in that, he breaks the fourth wall to tell the viewers about how the time machine that he invented in 1952 is now wreaking havoc in the formerly utopian year of 2052. Scientists can't even trust each other in one called The Black Planet. That one actually has Leslie Nielsen, the future star of Naked Gun. He actually appeared in 6 Tales of Tomorrow's. And in that one, he plays one of 2 astronauts who work together in search of a 10th planet. But then they soon become suspicious and jealous of each other. And they're all hot for this girl, Norma, who enters the picture. And, of course, one of the men ends up dead, and there's a murder mystery. And once again, science gets the short shrift. Many episodes, of course, in Tales of Tomorrow deal with doomsday scenarios. Of course, those are all caused by scientists. All the Time in the World is about whether life is even worth living after the hydrogen bomb drops. There's several Doomsday Virus episodes, which are particularly eerily prophetic now after the year of COVID. So this episode, the director Don Medford, he also did another episode of the series called World of Water, which has a scientist that he basically loses it over this sexy waitress that spurns him, and that makes him invent this serum that he calls a universal solvent, and it transforms all matter it comes into contact with into water, which, as you'd imagine, sets off the end of the world. Again, there's something about, even botanists. There's an episode, again, that Don Medford directed. Maybe Don Medford's the one who doesn't like scientists. An episode called The Fatal Flower, about a man-eating plant that becomes the subject of a shared obsession of the botanist that Victor Jory plays and his assistant. And they each have wildly different ideas about what to do with this homicidal houseplant that they create out in the Amazon jungle. It makes Audrey 2 from Little Shop of Horrors look like a sunflower by comparison. So, and Don Medford also directed The Invader, which we talked about at length in another commentary. That one's about a scientist he's basically too old and lame to go outside his research boat and investigate this mysterious glowing object that falls into the sea nearby. So he sends his son out there, even though his son's very ill-equipped for this kind of work. And his dad disdains the son because he just wants to be a writer. And of course the son, he goes out and looks, and he comes back and he's not quite right. And even Ava Gabor knows he's not quite right. But the scientist, as usual on this program, is a complete dumbass. There's also one called The Bitter Storm, which is really The Bitter Scientist. About a scientist who isolates himself on a remote island that's hit by a hurricane. And he's out there because he hates mankind. He thinks that they abuse all of his discoveries. And Medford also directed Youth on Tap, which the title kind of gives it away. It's a scientist who's paying young people to steal years of lives for themselves, and of course that doesn't go well for him. And really, Medford was kind of the philosophical director for the series. He directed probably the best of the bad scientists episode was The Horn, and that one's about a scientific piece of hardware that interfaces with human emotion. It's about a violin maker who's he moonlights as a scientific inventor, and he converts a French horn so that the sound it transmits affects the thoughts and feelings of the people that are listening to it. It directly affects the brain of the listener, and it can control them, which, of course, someone gets a hold of and is sabotaged by a jealous, failed musician, and things go as they are wont to do in this series. So in this one, Margaret Phillips, as we mentioned before, she kind of steals the show from Rod Steiger here, who was just kind of getting started off on his career. He'd been in one other Tales of Tomorrow before this, and, well, let's see, he had done, The Window was the episode of the Tales of Tomorrow he did, but around the same time of this, he was also in a science fiction show called Out There, so he wasn't a complete stranger to this sort of anthology television. There, Margaret Phillips just really goes all out. She steals the show because she was really the only star to get star billing at the beginning, if you notice, which is really about right, because nobody knew who Rod Steiger was, and you might notice James Dean plays a brief role in here as a scientist, although he comes and goes within a few minutes there. But yeah, in 1951, Phillips was known as an award-winning performance in the 1947 Broadway production of Another Part of the Forest. So when she did the show, she was a fairly known entity. What's kind of shocking about this episode, in fact, is that when she's waving around the knife there, it isn't so much to threaten Rod Steiger's character as it is to threaten to harm herself. And housewives committing suicide on national TV weren't really all that common in 1953. Tales of Tomorrow had sort of another running theme of the girls gone wild, I guess you could say. Although pretty much any time you saw a girl going wild on the series, you knew that she was in trouble and things were going to go really badly for her, because in this one, the serum does eventually wear off and she goes back to being, the nice, sweet little dainty housewife that all 50s television aspires to turn women into, apparently. Um, we talked also on other commentary with Scott Fisher about how anytime a woman on this series shows an independent streak, like the Veronica Lake in the Flight Overdue episode, she's basically playing an Amelia Earhart type character, a flyer. And the assumption is, of course, if she's smart enough to do what she's doing, to invent the things that she invents in that series, well, if she's brilliant, she must be cheating on her husband. It's the immediate assumption. And that seems to be also a running thread, almost as much as the dumb scientist thread through the series, that women are not to be trusted, and God forbid if a woman shows any kind of independent streak. Well, at least in The Evil Within, our dumb scientist of the week here doesn't quite destroy the world to get anybody killed. At least not on camera, anyways. But one wonders why he would bring the serum home. What happened was apparently the fridge at the lab went out. He had to bring it home. But of course, look at him. He's so stupid. He forgot his notes. He's looking around going, I invented this thing, but I don't have the notes. I'm going to have to go back to the lab and get them. And of course, the fact that he left her there all by herself with the stuff that he puts in the fridge, it drips onto. And by the way, that was an apple pie that it dripped onto. I don't know if you noticed that or not. And that's kind of funny and ironic, too, that the all-American apple pie becomes the instrument of her corruption there. But yeah, he has to go back to the lab. Once at the lab, then he realizes he's left something back at the house that he needs to go back and get it. That enables her to have the scene, where she gets to act all flirty and vampy and take a call from James Dean, where she basically is hitting on him. So it's really amusing in this series, I find, that for a show that champions science so much, scientists themselves are portrayed as pretty much the most dangerous beings on Earth here. So here we are back at the lab with James Dean. And he wasn't a stranger to TV at this point. He'd actually done quite a few shows, although not all of them have survived. Not all of them are extant to this day. In this one, he plays a scientist's assistant. He was 22 years old at the time. Of course, now, we best know him from his short but memorable movie career. But back at around the time of this and shortly after this, he was doing shows. There was a November 1954 episode of General Electric Theater called I'm a Fool. That was actually directed by Don Medford, the same director as this episode. So they would work together again shortly after this. But Dean didn't really get much to do in this, nor really does Rod Steiger, other than show what a dummy is. The show is basically stolen by the female lead, and that's why she gets star billing up top. We talked in 2 or 3 different commentaries about also how the condition of these episodes that we're watching now, the reason they look as they do isn't because of a low budget or a lack of attention to the details. What we're looking at for the most part is a kinescope. And what kinescopes were is the program, as it was being broadcast, they would basically just turn a film camera onto a television and then film the broadcast off of the screen. Which is really not the ideal way to capture it, but that's the only way that some 65 or 70 odd episodes of the series still survive to this day, is that they would do that. Initially, they did that for the coast-to-coast broadcast. Right around the time that this series debuted, in fact, was the first time that they were able to do simultaneous broadcasts from coast to coast. And they would also, because of the time change, they would tape this program, make this kinescope, and that would be what they used for the broadcast in the different time zones. And as it turned out, once Desi Arnaz proved that reruns were something worth considering keeping on television, they then proved to be sort of a goldmine of content in the early days of television when they were scrambling to come up with a way to fill all these hours and hours of broadcast time. But there was a lot of attention paid to the lighting and to the direction, even for early 1950s television. You can see here that there's a great depth of field. We see the monkey running around in the background, which itself is certainly a big chance to take, putting a live animal on the TV. The camera is not stationary. They don't just park it there, unlike certain special effect episodes like The Window, where it had to be parked in one place to capture that special effect. It actually was a fairly adventurous and daring series in the way that, look at the way the camera follows her to the mirror, and the fact that you have a mirror in a long shot like that and back, because there's a great danger of showing the camera in that. These are things that you didn't see all that often on 1950s television, particularly in science fiction television, which in this era that we're talking about was really considered a kiddie genre. The only other science fiction TV shows besides those occasional one-offs on anthology shows that we mentioned would be the sort of Saturday morning kiddie shows, your Space Patrol and Rod Brown and the Rocket Rangers sort of thing with silver spacesuits and people hanging from wires. That's really what science fiction was considered a children's genre at the time. So to not only be doing something here that pushes the boundaries of television production, but to also bring these noted science fiction authors, as we've talked about in other commentaries, Theodore Sturgeon and Arthur C. Clarke and so many others had their stories not only adapted for the series, but sometimes actually wrote for the series themselves. Frank DiFolita of Audrey Rose fame considers this some of his best work on television. And all of them, they weren't doing it just for the paycheck. This was, much like Twilight Zone several years after this, it was considered a groundbreaking and quality and somewhat prestigious program to work on, although it was certainly hard to convince some agents, as some of the interviewees that we spoke with confirmed. Going around town trying to sell science fiction scripts wasn't necessarily the way to get a lot of work in 1950, 51, 52. And as such, working on this series didn't necessarily lead to much of that sort of work for many of the people that worked on it as well. It wasn't, that sort of writing in particular wasn't a feather in the cap until after Twilight Zone was such a writer's series and showcased the writers, actually. Rod Serling would actually, in the original promos for those, introduce the writers for the upcoming episode by name. Unless it was him, of course, in which he would modestly demur and not say who wrote it. But he would go out of his way to tell you who wrote the upcoming episode. And as such, it was really only then that people began to get a feel for the prestigious approach that these people were putting into stories that, previous to this, really would have been looked at as just filler and fodder. Including on the anthology television programs that preceded and inspired this program, you'd be more likely to find this program, this type of subject matter played for laughs, particularly the way that she gets more and more histrionic after having ingested that poison slice of pie that he's just now starting to figure out that something's not quite right here. I know I don't pay much attention to my wife, but she's not usually quite this laughy. But poor Rod, he's doing the best he can. He was a somewhat ham-fisted actor even then, and look at the way she's absolutely just covering the whole range of emotions here. Her resentment, you can tell, has been seething for a long time. It's not just about her eating the slice of pie and taking on personality traits that aren't her own. What's happening is it's exaggerating the resentment, the anger, frustration she's felt because she's married to this dumbass who pays no attention to how absolutely gorgeous she is. And here she whips out the knife, which is extremely daring for early 50s television. But she's not threatening to hurt him so much as threatening to hurt herself, which may be kind of a cop-out in that, they probably didn't feel like they could show in prime time, the threat of violence against someone else so much as the threat of violence against herself, because, again, there's this perception that, the woman can't really be trusted, can't really be in her right mind, can she? And so there's more leeway to sort of play with this fantasy element with her, which we don't realize at this point is going to wear off. We don't realize that the serum is really only temporary. James Dean has discovered this off-camera in the lab, and he calls up and he actually makes our protagonist here aware of it. But at the moment, if you're watching this without having seen it before, we're basically watching a scene from a slasher movie here. She's holding this huge knife, threatening to kill herself, and this guy is completely clueless. He knows absolutely nothing about what he should possibly do about this. So, maybe I'll just answer the phone while my wife's standing in the kitchen with this big-ass knife. But look again how this is staged, though. Look at the fact that the depth of field actually shows her all the way in this other room through a doorway. And look at the lighting on her from overhead as she holds up this knife. It's actually a very psycho-type look here. She almost looks like Norman Bates. Very threatening, very scary, actually, considering it's daylight lighting practically. And Rod, unfortunately, here, Rod Steiger is not up to the challenge of reacting here the way he should. Instead, it looks like he's going to cry over having spilt a bowl of cereal or something. He's not really, and the script actually, unfortunately, doesn't really give him much opportunity to either. He's basically reacting to exposition here, which is poorly piped in, of James Dean telling him that just keep her busy for a little while longer, or she'll go back to being the sweet dame that you've been ignoring all these years. And but at least we're visually getting something really interesting here. We're actually seeing in these little glimpses of his home life. If you notice, we have, there's notes all over the place. There's filing cabinets with papers all hanging out of them. He's transformed his home into sort of a satellite office. And so we see these visual references to why the wife is so resentful and why she does feel like she's been resigned to more of the role of a secretary, answering phones. And maybe that's why when she gets the chance to be all vampy with James Dean there, she takes that opportunity. Might have done that even without the serum, because God knows her life must be pretty boring with this poor old dumbass Rod Steiger. And it's a somewhat shabby apartment. We see, evidence that they have somewhat inexpensive furniture. Although she here is dressed to the nines, she really is trying to impress him. When he came home, she was all up for this here. And unfortunately, he paid no attention. All he was interested in was getting that serum and finding them notes and getting back to the lab and hanging out with young James Dean. And we really don't see any reaction from him here. He's basically just trying to run down the clock, and so it's left to her to basically do this whole carrying of the end of the episode, which she does so well. Look at the gleam of the reflection of the knife on her pearl, or on her diamonds rather. That sort of thing doesn't happen by accident. These shows were usually filmed in the space of 3 days, sometimes 2, usually on Friday in New York. And they would have sometimes one all the way run through rehearsal, but not always. One suspects that this is one of those episodes that didn't have a complete run through, judging by Rod Steiger's inability, it seems, to sort of remember his place in the script, where he's supposed to what he's supposed to be doing at any given point. There are a couple of parts of it that do seem possibly ad-libbed. But we close out here with this, after having seen this near slasher movie scene. We want to sell you some watches, and so here's this beautiful watch band from Chrysler, and which actually is quite a lovely little piece. Chrysler would go on to off and on sponsor this series right through the very end, though there were a few others that would come on from time to time. As we mentioned in a couple of other commentaries, they were fairly instrumental in launching the series. It was their interest and their wallet, basically, that enabled this to get off the ground when the Science Fiction League of America made their stories available as a sort of database for this new idea, this anthology TV series. And hopefully they sold a lot of watches. Chrysler was a big brand in its time. In its own way, it was probably bigger than Tales of Tomorrow, at least in retrospect, since the series is somewhat forgotten nowadays. So, but we enjoyed this one. Margaret Phillips we enjoyed especially. And I want to thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed it. And we will probably see and hear you again on another commentary. So thank you again for buying, and have a good day.